All right, now that we have the code to enable and disable the text field, let's also go ahead and do the same for the four predefined buttons that we see in the application as well. So the good thing about this is that basically the buttons should always be enabled when the greeting text field should be disabled. So we can create a new observable that is just the exact opposite of the greeting text field enabled observable. So let's go ahead. Buttons enabled observable. And this is going to be a very simple map this time. It's again an observable of type bool that we're creating here. And it's going to be called, or we are going to create it by using the greeting text field enabled observable, and we're calling map. And in here we are receiving a bool from the observable greeting enabled of type bool, and we want to return a bool, but this time we're just transforming the bool into its opposite, so we can just go ahead and say return the contrary of greeting enabled. And this is our buttons enabled property, and now I could go and bind it to each button individually, or I can do the same inside a for loop because I have the buttons inside an array, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to create the for loop here, greeting buttons dot for each, which gives me a for loop that I can use where every button is coming like this. And then inside the for loop, I can just go ahead and bind the greeting enabled observable to the button that we currently iterate over. It's the buttons enabled property, buttons enabled observable, bind to the button.rx.is enabled. All right, running this code now will actually make sure already that the text field and the buttons are properly enabled in the different scenarios. And of course, we have to add the result of the binding to the text field. So here we see that the buttons are enabled. I can press them, I can interact with them. The text field is disabled. If I switch the selected segment of the UI segmented control up here, then we see that we can start typing and everything works out just fine. All right, let's take a look at the next requirement, because we actually don't have to combine only the custom greeting with the name. In fact, we have to take either the button that was selected last and use that binding or use that greeting up here in the greeting label, or we have to use the greetings from the text field. So let's first create an observable that always stores the last value of, or that always emits the last value based on which button has been tapped. And the simplest way of doing so we have a couple of different ways how we could implement this, but the simplest way of doing so is by implementing a property of type variable. So this is going to be the last selected greeting, and it's of type variable. That's going to hold a string, and we're just going to initialize it with the default value with the first selected value. And in fact, a variable, again, is also only a wrapper around the type of an observable, but this time we can actually add values to this observable ourselves, or to this variable ourselves, and these values will then be emitted by the observables so that we can still this observable for bindings. First, let's make sure that we always set the latest value of the lastly selected button on this variable, and we can do this by listening for the button taps. So rather than having to create an IB action, what we can do when we're using RxSwift is that we can subscribe to a button tab. And I'm actually going to do this right here because we need to do it for every button individually. And the code for this looks like this. That again, we're using the reactive extension of the UI button class, and we're using the tab, and we subscribe to this with the onNext function that we already know. And this will actually emit an event. This will actually emit an event every time the button is tapped. So here we can write a closure where we are actually taking in something of type void. So to be explicit, I'm going to add the type annotation here, but it's actually not really something that we have to care about because the tap event is not carrying any values. It's just telling us that the button has been tapped. And here we can go and refer to the variable that we just created. What did I call it? Last selected greeting. And the way how we can put values onto the observable here is by just calling .value, and we're using the current title property of the button and assigning this to the value, and this will make sure that we are putting the current title of the button that has been selected onto the observable, and now we can use it for bindings.